I am Kathy Brett with Becker's Healthcare. The program will begin with a presentation, and we will have a question and answer session following completion of the presentation. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenters will attempt to answer as many questions as they can during the time we have and will follow up on any questions they do not have the opportunity to address. You will receive an email within about a week following the webinar that will include instructions for how you can download a copy of the presentation. You will also receive a follow-up email shortly after completion of the program, and you can submit your feedback or any additional questions at that time. This email will not include the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's three presenters. Gauthier van Eetvelde of McKinsey Company. Gauthier van Eetvelde is a consultant, executive coach, and facilitator specialized in change management. He is a former McKinsey engagement manager focused on organizational behavior and currently works with McKinsey Solutions. Gauthier started coaching his peers as a teenager, and his practice has grown over time to teams and senior executives. As a consultant and trained facilitator, Gauthier focuses on interactive interventions in organizational effectiveness and change, capability building, and team alignment. Gauthier holds an MBA from INSEAD and was further educated at ICHEC in Brussels, where he holds a master's degree in business engineering. He has 6 years of experience in designing and facilitating experiential workshops focused both on personal insight and capability building. He also has several years' experience as a project manager in major transformation programs. We also have James Stanford of Objective Health. James is a client service executive with more than a decade of experience serving organizations across the healthcare sector. Recent work with hospitals includes a comprehensive performance transformation engagement for a multi-hospital system, an accelerated margin improvement program for a large independent hospital, and a physician alignment strategy for a regional health system. Experience with other healthcare industries include designing and launching a shared services business unit at a health insurer and creating a new physician reimbursement model for a regional payer to improve quality, eliminate unnecessary hospitalizations, and reduce total healthcare costs. Prior to joining McKinsey, James was director on the faculty of the advisory board academies and earned an MBA in healthcare management from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. James also holds a BA from Princeton University. And finally, we have Joshua Sens of Objective Health. Joshua serves as Chief Information Officer for Objective Health and is based in the Cleveland office, where he joined the firm in 2006. As a founding member of Objective Health, he was instrumental in the development of the business infrastructure, analytics engine, and client-facing web application. In his current role, Josh is responsible for managing Objective Health's data operations, application development, and data strategy. Prior to joining McKinsey, Josh spent over 10 years as an entrepreneur in the financial services industry. He served on the top team of a successful startup venture, as well as working as an independent consultant to Fortune 500 companies focused on customer relationship management, direct sales and marketing, and asset retention. Josh holds an MBA from the Weatherhead School of Business, excuse me, too much speaking, the Weatherhead School of Business at Case Western, with a concentration in marketing and information technology, and an undergraduate degree from Yale University in behavioral neuroscience. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Gauthier to begin today's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so for the next presentation, we're going to start focusing on what are the key challenges and approaches for change management and making it successful. After that, we'll be focusing more on what are the formal systems and processes that entails, and then we'll dive into a provider case study, and as Kathy mentioned, we'll have plenty of time after that for Q&A. So change management, next slide please, is an extremely important topic, because we can all make a decision on what is the right direction, but unless we understand what we actually need to do to make it happen, it's a bit meaningless. So what McKinsey has been doing in the past several years is really trying to understand what are the key factors of that, and doing several hundreds of thousands of research and talking to lots and lots of people to try to understand that, and as well interviewing several thousands of leaders. Could we click, please? To try to understand what's behind all of that. And so what we found, if we go to the next slide please, is that most organizations, no matter what industry, are actually ongoing different transformations at different levels. Can we click please? And what we realize is that the rate of success of companies that are trying to change but do not have holistic programs is very small. Click please. But what we do see is that when organizations engage in holistic programs, have a much greater rate of success. Next slide, please. So about 80% if they do have holistic programs. Next slide, please. So when we think of change, and we've all heard that 70% of change efforts fail, and this is no matter what the change is, whether it's a big structural change, whether it's a merger, whether it's a new product launch, whether it's even a new IT system rollout. So it touches everything. But a lot of people talk about change, and if you search on Amazon, you find hundreds of books about how to make people do what you want them to do without them wanting it. But what you do realize is that guerrilla change, next slide please, does not work. Now, it's always good to remind ourselves of the sarcastic nature that's in all of us, and understanding that one size fits all will not work. If we are focused only on process management, we're missing the point and not adding value. So what I'd like to do now is ask you all a question. If we could go to the next slide, and it's a poll. And I'd like to ask you, in your experience of strategic initiatives or any other change efforts, what are the main reasons they fail? So I'd like to invite everybody here to pick up to 2 answers in the list here. And I realize we can consider other factors, but out of these 5 here, which ones do you believe are the most significant? So just take a minute to choose 2 of the 5 that are listed there. And really just leverage in your experience, in your organization. Okay, just going to leave it just a little bit longer. About 60% of you have placed a vote. We'll wait another few moments. Okay, another 10 seconds and then we'll close the poll. Okay, great. Kathy, can we see the results? Okay, so thank you, Kathy. I'm difficult looking at it. So we see, as you see, the vision seems to be the vision not being aligned with business reality or not clearly understood in the organization coming out on top, and the lack of leadership involvement. But what you do see is that a lot of people seem to agree that it's not a clear-cut decision between all of these. Now, keeping that in mind, if we go to the next slide, and we'll come back to this in a few moments, there are 3 kinds of failures that happen in any kind of large-scale transformations. The first difficulty that we face when trying to change is the failure to launch a change. Whether we're stuck in the diagnostics and we're kind of bickering over what to do and should we go left or right, and people are resisting the change. Can we click on next? The failure to sustain, i.e. we have a great idea, great technical change, but it's not becoming embedded in the day-to-day of everybody. And then the last one, click please, failure to scale. we got a lot of different efforts, and we're starting, but we're not finishing, and we're not involving everybody there. So we keep pockets of excellence, but we can't manage to get and touch everybody else. So what our research has shown is that why these 70% of change efforts fail. Can we go to the next slide, please? And click again. Is that what we realize is that the key factor here is all linked to organizational behaviors. And yes, obviously having adequate resources and budget is important. It is clear that we need to have a very clear vision as well. But the key factors that prevent us from having successful change, and this is average across several industries in many years, is employee resistance to change and management behavior that does not support the change. And so we realize that and say, well, if behavior is the key thing and not the decision of which change to do and how it's particularly rolled out, how do we impact these behaviors? So if we could go to the next slide, and I invite you to read through an example which you may or may not recognize, understanding that all the different stakeholders in a change of an organization, between a CEO making a bold decision, that feeling confident that this is the right way, and trickling down all the way to the frontline management, having people who may feel that, like an executive committee that doesn't feel it's the right direction, may not be engaged, which may be kind of reluctant, which may not feel they have been consulted enough or taken into account enough. Their report senior management may not understand where this is coming from, in particular if their managers are reluctant themselves. And frontline management, what we often see is they kind of have the little voice that we sometimes do, oh, here's another change coming in from the ivory tower. If I keep my head down, this will go away. And so what we're facing is an entire system of mindsets and behaviors which are blocking the change. And so the key thing is, how do we face this? How can we impact the things that are visible, the behavior, but everything else that's going on for each one of us, the mindsets? And so if we could go to the next slide, this is a bit the model that comes from hundreds and hundreds of change programs, is what we call the influence model. And we say, so at the center, I will change the way I work. I will change my behavior if I see others adopting it, whether it's in leaders and colleagues or direct reports, so role modeling. I will change the way I behave, the way I work, if I am convinced this is the right change and I understand how we're going to do it and it makes sense to me personally, so understanding and conviction. The third one is about having the right skills and capabilities. I will change the way I behave if I have the tools in hand, the right knowledge and the right capabilities of doing so. And the last one, which is often where we tend to focus too much, if the processes, the structure and the systems encourage me to adopt this new behavior. And it's not so much about one being more important than the other, it's being sure that we pull all four levers simultaneously. And I just want now to walk through a few examples of what this could mean. Could we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of role modeling, it is about, having senior management taking targeted leadership actions, these small actions which has high visibility and high impact on the rest of the organization, involving a network of change agents at different levels of the organization, and generating as many interaction opportunities between people that are adopting the new behaviors that are driving the change and everybody else that needs to be impacted. Next slide, please. In terms of building understanding and conviction in the change, is about having a clear mission and vision dialogue with the organization, having them feel involved, having a personal story with personal anecdotes developed by a chief executive officer or another senior manager that actually links with the different people and makes sense for them in terms of why is this important to them? What are the values behind this? What is the case for change? Why are we doing this? And then how the story cascaded throughout the organization in a meaningful way. And what we mean by that is that the story isn't then articulated in everybody's words, but the key messages trickle all the way through the organization. Next slide, please. And developing talent and skills, yes, there's an element of skills training and capability building, classroom or e-learnings or whatever. But beyond that, there's an extreme importance of leadership development at all levels. And very important to bring in the on-the-job learning that we see others. So that may be linked back to role modeling, but really focusing on that as well, and never to forget thinking about talent management as well here. Can we go to the next slide? And then, so I will change the way I behave, the way I work, if the systems support that, and that could be the organization structure, that can be the targets and metrics or KPIs, the different processes, whether they're business processes, management processes, rewards, consequence management, or even IT systems have that kind of impact. So this is kind of, if we go to the next slide, the key that we found in terms of driving change. And obviously each situation is different and it needs to be articulated differently in different circumstances for different people and the different organizations. But the key thing is pulling these 4 levers in a way to touch everybody involved in the change throughout an organization, throughout the hospital, so that people believe the change, see others adopting the change, have the skills to do so, and understand and have the perception at least that the formal mechanisms and systems of the hospital encourage them to do so. Okay, next slide, please. I'll be handing over to Josh.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Gauthier. So, to start out talking about formal systems and processes, as Gauthier mentioned, this is really one of the pieces of the overall influence model that we need to drive in order to make change happen in an organization. But it's actually a really important one, and one that we see a lot of opportunity for in the healthcare space, because it's really these formal systems and processes that help to provide the backbone of support for the organization to help use the other levers of the influence model to ultimately meet their goals. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking through this in more detail, and then we'll go on to a case study to show how we start to put both the influence model and formal systems and processes into practice with some of our clients. Next slide, please. So as we start, would like to have everyone, we're going to do another interactive poll, and would like to have everyone think about their set of current strategic initiatives and just select one of these options that best describes the type of change and the type of capabilities that you believe are required in order to meet your organization's goals. Yeah, I think we'll leave it open for another 30 seconds or so. Okay, I think we can close it. Okay, so if we look at the results of this, I think this is not very surprising to us. This is the story that we're hearing from our clients as well, and especially when you look at the industry that we're in and undergoing the change, whether it be the idea of healthcare reform and the effects that it's going to have on my organizations, or having to operate more profitably at Medicare reimbursement rates, the trends towards sharing of risk and ultimately population health management. There are a lot of big, lofty goals that organizations like yours very likely have, and quite frankly, a lot of new capabilities that frontline staff and the people on your teams are going to need to be able to employ in order to reach those goals. So we can go back to the presentation on the next slide. So when we think about change management and ways in which organizations set set up formal systems and processes in order to support that. We think about this, against two of these options, very similar to the questions that you just answered in the poll. So first of all, how much change are we really trying to achieve? And then what level of capabilities are going to be required, especially new capabilities for our organization, in order to do that? And that puts us into a matrix that you're seeing, and we'll talk very quickly about each of the components, and then where we see the need in the healthcare space. First, if we start at the bottom left, we have what we call the nerve center, and this is for the idea of doing really being all about execution and using skills that your staff already has in not significant amounts of change. In this case, the key element of how you need to organize around this is really to think about how do we coordinate effort. So, the example of this is multiple departments approaching their own change initiatives and using tools and processes that work for them in order to execute better, but how do we at least pull that together and have a common view of that? If we start to move up the chain to the blue quadrant and think about, as levels of complexity and as the ambition of how much change we're looking at start to evolve, we start to bring in both the idea of not just pulling the pieces together from more of a reporting standpoint, but actually thinking about how we drive change as an organization and doing things in what we would describe as a change management framework. So things like, how do we share a common vision through layers of a complex organization, or how do we handle different sets of stakeholders that may be involved across more robust efforts. And a lot of times what we're seeing is that this is the type of approach that systems will use across multiple facilities to try to drive system level goals, for instance. If we move to the green quadrant, then we see that as we start to have a need for new capabilities, there's the whole idea of how do we start to actually position the organization in a way where you can build expertise and new skills, as well as both develop and share best practices. And that's really the capability add-on to that coordination. And I think a lot of existing hospitals and health systems are doing this through performance improvement groups, through lean ops focused efforts. But it's really in a targeted way building capabilities in a specific area. When we look back to the results of the poll, and we actually bring this back to the picture that we're seeing with our clients, the reality is that most hospitals feel like in their strategic initiatives, they really are dealing with significant amounts of change as well as significant new capabilities, and that puts us in the orange quadrant of what we call revolutionizer. And this is really characterized more by a centralized group that is playing a prominent role in both driving the change management and the content expertise at an enterprise level. We would also talk about this as real, world-class program management capability. And we're starting to see more and more of this as hospitals and health systems are forming things like strategic initiative offices or enterprise-level PMOs. However, it feels like we're in early days of that. So if I look across this, matrix, it's really important that based on the level of change we're trying to achieve, we organize ourselves in a way that we can actually put formal systems and processes together in order to actually meet those goals. So if our goals are in the orange, we should not be setting up our systems to manage that in the gray. It's an important gap that we're working with clients today to really help solve. And then, regardless of what your goals are, the formal systems and processes really help to support you around two specific items. The first is around overall program structure and accountability, and the second is around information transparency and progress tracking. So quickly go through a little bit more detail on that, and then we can get to our case study. So next slide, please. So when we talk about structure and accountability, Gauthier mentioned that we've done a lot of studies on what drives successful change programs, and one of the things that we're able to draw from that is that change initiatives that have real structure and clear accountability help drive the success of the likelihood of success of those initiatives by a factor of over 6 times. So a very significant difference of how this drives the ultimate results of whether a program is successful or not. And when we think about what a well-structured and well-managed program and accountability framework provides, it really helps to do a couple of things. So first, it's by linking initiatives up to specific programs, it helps create a common understanding of how individual goals ultimately tie back to a much more bold and memorable aspiration. It provides leadership with the direction to help prioritize and really drive the right sets of actions at the right pace. And lastly, it sets the stage for measuring performance to make sure that the actions that we are performing are actually having the desired impact that we would expect. Next slide, please. In terms of what we see, typically hospitals, and this is true across industries as well, but specifically in the healthcare space, hospitals have really lacked the robust set of tools in order to manage and structure program management. So what does this mean? If we can click in. So program management tools are really about how do we set up and manage a portfolio of initiatives. And initiatives may mean projects. There are lots of different names that we bring to this. But ultimately, how do we roll up sets of actions, sets of initiatives, sets of projects into a common theme or a common program? Once we do that, we can then start to monitor the achievement both at the initiative level as well as the program level. It also provides for more of the information transparency that we'll talk about in a moment. So what we see today is that really there are sets of tools that are being used to manage projects, but they're very fragmented, and they're used in specific departments, and really don't roll up to provide this overall link to the strategic initiatives. Or in cases where there has been a centralized group that's assigned responsibility for more programmatic efforts, these typically are using standalone tools. The one we see most frequently is Microsoft Excel. And and really it's a standalone tool that's not able to distribute that type of information to the right people, and quite frankly ultimately results in usually multiple FTEs running around trying to update status rather than actually trying to help drive the change that's intended. So if we click in briefly, I don't want to say that there's not a need for very tactical department level project management or working tools, but these need to be integrated into an overall program management structure in order to ensure successful change. Next slide, please. So the second item about systems and processes is how do they provide transparency and progress tracking throughout multiple levels of the organization. And there are really two key items for this. So on the left-hand side, we see again the results of our surveys and our research that basically says, programs do better if people are able to get the right information at the right time to monitor progress, and then have the ability to course correct if necessary. If we move to the right-hand side, we also see that it's important to understand performance for both progress, which is the idea of are we doing what we said we were going to go do, but also specifically around impact and metrics, or the actual results. So are we having the impact that we expected? Both of these taken together ultimately, increase the likelihood of success by somewhere between 5x to 7x, and are very important pieces of the formal systems and processes that you need to put in place in order to ensure this type of success. Next slide, please. If we take this to a very quick example of putting this idea of transparency and tracking into practice, what we find is that a set of robust program management tools, when combined with a regular review process, can really help organizations create a framework that evolves over time, and it really integrates into both their, it works best when it integrates both into their existing workflow and into their regular management reviews and meetings. So in the example we've shown here, we see a cascading set of meetings. So starting at the top right, a monthly meeting by the management team that then turns into more of a midterm review by the management team responsible for the specific initiatives, ultimately down to the weekly reviews and performance dialogues that are conducted at the frontline staff level. So there are two main benefits that this type of framework provides, and the first one is it really provides the ability to link frontline activity to the senior management goals, and it really enforces the involvement of leadership to drive the change efforts that they're after. Secondly is that it allows the organization to react more quickly to issues when they arise and take corrective actions, and ultimately creates a culture in which there is an iterative step change process, and really helps the organization learn and develop new capabilities over that time. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about how program management tools can help when combined with processes and structures in order to drive change. When we look at best-in-class program management tools, it's really important that we think about what are their capabilities throughout the life cycle of organizational change, and that's not a one-time effort during a strategic planning process. It's really an ongoing multi-year journey and a commitment in order to actually drive this into the way an organization conducts their business. So, the first step of that is that, they need to be a part of the planning process. And, how do we help use these to capture ideas, to prioritize, and essentially set targets for our goals? We can click, please. It's important that then we're able to link this to our execution or implementation phase. And really, this is where the communication and the transparency and the robust progress and impact tracking come in order to understand, are we doing what we said we were going to do, and make sure that things don't die on the vine. Next click, please. And finally, the idea of of sustaining this, and it's really helping to answer the question of how are we doing against our strategy. So not just at a point in time, but really creating a culture through the organization where this is an iterative process, and and the organization is able to handle some of those lofty goals that we identified in the beginning, as well as develop the capabilities in order to meet those goals. So now I'm going to pass it over to James Stanford, who's one of our client service executives, and he can talk through how are some of our clients, or specific examples of how our clients are putting this into practice today.
Thank you, Josh. All right, so to kick off here, have the final poll of the day on the next slide, which asks the question, how many major change initiatives are you planning for next year? And when I'm talking about major initiatives, I mean where whole departments or groups of physicians need to change the way they work in significant ways. So let's keep the poll open for 15 more seconds or whatever it takes to get a good survey. About 10 more seconds. All right, let's close the poll down, please. Great. So, so I think it's clear that almost everybody's doing something, and the vast majority of people have 2 to 3 major change initiatives going on at one time, and some have even more than that. And as you get to those numbers, it gets more and more complex, where one initiative has an impact on the other initiatives. And I contend that that number is going to be increasing, especially for U.S. hospitals over the next few years. And people can imagine why that is. So let's talk about what it takes to actually manage in that complexity, and to make sure that of all of the initiatives that fall into that 70% that fail, how do we avoid that? And how do we recognize of the 30% that succeed, how do they do it? So let's take an example of a health system that's getting it right. Next slide, please. So I want to use an example of a roughly $1 billion 4-hospital system that identified a need to improve its operating margin by $100 million by 2019. And the leaders of the organization embraced this aspiration, and the CEO ensured that all 6,000 employees knew about it. Click, please. They identified a set of change themes, which were divided into performance themes, which would get them to their $100 million, and health themes, which would make sure that they're doing it responsibly. And this is what Josh was talking about when he's describing the overall program structure, that they fit into these performance themes and health themes. Within each of these themes, click please, they identified a large number of potential initiatives, each with its own owners, key performance indicators, timelines, and resource requests. And it became very clear that this was going to be a revolutionizer type of change based on the amount of change that was happening and the complexity. So it involved coordination, as any of change does, but also significant change management and capability building. Next slide, please. And so to account for that and to make sure that they were giving the revolutionizer approach its due, rather than hit go on all of the initiatives, they first undertook a methodological approach to select a portfolio of initiatives that would work coherently together. They first evaluated each of the initiatives based on its expected impact and its feasibility, prioritizing those into quick wins, start now, capture laters, start later initiatives, and not for nows. Those are the ones that they were deprioritized right off the bat. Then they looked at all of the ideas as a portfolio, assessing risk and timing to balance the portfolio so that they could manage the risk of these initiatives over time, understanding that something that has very low risk may be something that you can do immediately, but the more risk, the more time it helps to give to an initiative. Finally, they looked at capacity, capital capacity, individual leadership capacity, organizational capacity, to manage the initiatives of the next 3 to 6 years. And critically, they let many good initiatives go so that they could ensure success of the coherent few that remained. So next slide, please. Some of the initiatives were obvious fixes that they could start immediately. But before they moved forward with the bulk, they applied that culture change framework that Gauthier mentioned up front, called the influence model, to the overall change effort to ensure that they are properly considering the culture and the capabilities of the organization. And of the 4 key components, when it came to role modeling, they showed that as leaders, through their own actions, how important this change effort was. For example, they made a practice of reviewing a standardized set of reports about the change effort in every monthly meeting. And the ongoing reporting demands and actions coming out of those meetings signaled to all the employees of the organization that it was top of mind for the leadership. What's more, all the leaders publicly built in change goals into their performance criteria to show that they were walking the talk. And so, click to the next piece. The next one, understanding and conviction. This is about crafting that change story that Gauthier mentioned. It's absolutely critical, and to make sure that relevant stakeholders understand and agree on what they need to do. So for the board, they rewrote the system governing principles to remove platitudes and redefine the strength of the system. And this was a system that had been kind of a system in name only. And I'm sure that you've seen many examples of this, where the hospitals are fiercely independent. And it was very clear that that wasn't going to work anymore to create the sustainable model that they needed. And if hospitals couldn't get on board with that, the leader was very clear that the hospitals would be separated from the system. To create the burning platform for employees, she scheduled a series of town halls that highlighted the $100 million imperative and explained the hard work that would take to complete. And to help those individuals understand exactly what was expected of them, they insisted that all initiative plans cascade down to each level of the organization to ensure clarity. There's more on that later. The next piece, click please, developing talent and skill. They created an internal consulting department to provide problem-solving and change management resources to change teams. They developed lean management and problem-solving skills for managers and their internal consultants. And they reviewed succession plans for leaders to ensure that the right competencies would be in place for the new landscape. The final piece, click to formal systems and processes. They established that program management office to manage the change. They provided a single source of the truth, transparency, and accountability through a suite of data tools that I'll discuss in just a moment. They dissolved all the existing committees that had overlapping goals and gave full authority to the new ones. And they built a single EMR for the entire system to include the affiliated physicians. Next slide, please. So the actions they took to drive the culture change were informed by a survey that they'd had every employee complete to understand how they'd managed change in the past. And what you see here is a wordle representing the frequency that a word came up in those free response sections. And not surprisingly, communication was the most commonly cited need. But the question is, what kind of communication? It's very, very catch-all. But the survey also showed that while the executives felt very supportive of the previous changes, there was a huge drop-off in understanding and support at the very next level of management, and that continued to deteriorate. This was a wake-up call to the leaders that they had to rethink how they defined, planned, and launched initiatives. So for example, on the next slide, when I talk about cascading the initiatives down through the organization, whereas in the past they might have thought about an initiative to reduce average length of stay. And everyone might know that there's an initiative to reduce average length of stay. Not everyone knows what role they play in it and what their expectations are. And they explicitly wrote out that cascade for each level and established KPIs for them. In the next slide, please. They also developed a process for managing performance across all the initiatives. They used a program management tool that included all the initiatives, and this is what Josh is talking about, finding an integrated way across the organization that they could easily manipulate to show the initiatives by the owner, by performance theme, by status, etc., so they could see what was on track to celebrate success and course correct as necessary. On the next slide, we talk about a cross-system dashboard that they set up to track key metrics across the hospitals in a simple scorecard that measured current performance versus target performance. And these also they would use in those monthly meetings I described to track at a high level performance themes and health themes. They were also in those meetings able to dive into specific drivers of performance through analyzers like the one on the next slide that in this case shows the drivers and costs of clinical variation. And having the data at their fingertips where they could start at a high level but had the power to go to the details immediately, it significantly sped up the implementation. More importantly, it allowed the leaders to quickly address and overcome standard obstacles that get in the way of decisive action. So for example, when physicians raise very reasonable questions about data validity and data comparisons, they were able to get the physicians in a room, recut the data together based on all of the concerns the physicians had, and allowed them to get to agreement in ways that wouldn't have happened across multiple meetings waiting for data requests to be fulfilled. And so with that, those are the things that they've had going on. The good news is that they've been able to be on track to meet their near-term goals. It's a multi-year initiative, but after the first year, they're on track to make roughly $25 million in margin improvement. And more to come the year after that. They do have some ongoing challenges that they're working through, but the structure that they've put in place is flexible enough to both look for those sorts of challenges and actively address them. And so I think it's just an excellent example of how an organization is able to take into account all of the important cultural and capability needs while also building in those formal structures and processes that Josh mentioned to give themselves the best chance at getting into that 30% of strategic initiatives that succeed. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to question and answers, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Gauthier, Josh, and James for a very informative and enjoyable presentation. We're now going to begin the Q&A portion of the program, and as a reminder to attendees, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenters will attempt to answer as many questions as they can during this time, and will follow up on questions they do not have the opportunity to address. We do have a question here to start off. It's for James. And this person asks, what is the best way to wean strategic initiative focus away from the Microsoft Excel? And do you recommend limiting to certain usage?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question about how do you introduce new tools, especially when old tools are more familiar. And I think that it actually goes back to a bit of what Josh was describing in his section, which is that for the day-to-day management, it's usually, I think, most successful to let them work with what they know and kind of work top-down at introducing new types of strategic initiative focus. So, for example, if you're using Excel in an individual department to manage the very specific day-to-day tactics, keep doing that, but have a way to roll that up quickly to some sort of means that more effectively manages for all the leaders who have comprehensive view of the organization and the change initiative, how they're going to work, and then cascade it down over time depending on the complexity of the change, depending on the receptivity of the individuals to new tools, which will be driven by what they're using today, how comfortable they're with it, and if they have specific problems with what they're working on. And then also bring them along for that conversation to say, let's have an active conversation about what works well, what doesn't, how can we do these in a more integrated fashion.
Okay, thank you. This question will be for Josh, and the question is, how are hospitals different from other businesses or organizations? How does that impact change management approach?
So I think there are actually lots of ways that hospitals are different from other organizations. The few that come to mind relatively quickly is the complexity of the types of stakeholders that are involved. So oftentimes there are relationships that are not quite as hierarchical as there may be in other industries. And then one of the other challenges is, quite frankly, the fact that the frontline staff is typically performing very complex activities on a given basis, and quite frankly, especially when we think of the tools and types of program or project management tools that may be available, oftentimes are not in a position where they're directly sitting at a computer for significant amounts of time during the day. So so that being said, there are some significant differences. I think it's actually more important in my mind to think about where the similarities exist, and because of the complexity of the stakeholder environment, there typically are established management structures and meeting structures that allow for the ability to start bringing in regular reporting around around a structured set of programs and initiatives that all link back to a strategy. And then the other way is, I think the other similarity is that people in general want change to happen, and when programs and initiatives are well structured in a very cascading kind of way, will be very active participants in helping to drive improvement efforts if they can understand how the work that I'm doing today actually matters towards that overall improvement goal. So the quick example of one goal may be to improve excess length of stay across the organization. That needs to be cascaded down to the right level of activities so that when a nurse is performing her job differently, she understands that as I'm changing my discharge planning or my care delivery, this is how that's ultimately rolling up to an overall goal like that. So it's actually connecting those dots, and I think that those are the desire for that type of change is something that healthcare has a unique opportunity to capitalize on.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Here is another question for you. Is there a particular software product for senior leadership to use to pull the information into a concise dashboard? So
the answer to that is yes. There are various options for that are available to teams for this. To be very transparent about this, Objective Health offers a solution that does most of what we discussed today around creating that single version of the truth in terms of measuring the performance on the metrics that matter to C teams. Also, being able to structure and manage and link initiatives and actions back to those. But then I also want to be clear that there are many other systems that can accomplish this as well. So whether it's internal BI tools or it's other collaborative types of software that allow the leadership view to actually translate down through that structured set of initiatives and link back to the metrics. That's really the key importance of this. So whether there's one specific system or not that would work better for this, we obviously like to think that we've designed our system around the best practices that we've seen and that we've shared with you today. But it's also something that a lot of our clients and a lot of the industry has been building internally as well.
Okay, great, thank you. This question would be for Gauthier. Do you recommend a dyad approach to strategic initiatives with business development and strategic planning at service line level to more effectively aid in transformation that more closely aligns with operational and financial improvements?
Okay. I'm trying to make sense of it. Sorry, maybe a silly question.
So Gauthier, I can take this one if you'd like.
Go for it.
So I've seen this work pretty well in a couple of different settings. At least two of the clients that I work with have moved to this. And I was initially a little concerned about the loss of single point accountability, having one person who is ultimately in charge. But I've been more than convinced that the benefits that come well outweigh those concerns. Josh or Gauthier, anything you'd like to add to that?
I agree there's an added level of complexity by having such an approach, but I agree.
Okay, great, thank you. We do have time for a few more questions here. Here's one. Can you share examples of change initiatives you did at hospitals? What worked, what didn't, for instance?
Sure. So I can take that one. And I'm thinking specifically, actually, of a recent one that was pretty successful around labor productivity improvement. And the way that they approached it was to say, what is the productivity that we need to be able to have today, a year from now, and 5 years from now, given the changes going on in our landscape, and said, okay, let's prepare for a year from now to start off with. And so for that, they said, let's start by looking at some external benchmarks. But I think what was critical about the success of this initiative, and I'm sure that everyone on this phone call has dealt with the problems of external benchmarks and the difficulty of getting an apples-to-apples comparison. So while the leadership used external benchmarks to set some initial productivity goals, they communicated those to all of the leaders through a set of internal benchmarks and say, okay, we've come to the understanding that you can get to your 75th percentile best performance, for example, which means that 25% of the time you're doing really well. How can you get to that sort of performance more frequently? And by framing it in terms of an internal benchmark, it helped the leaders of those departments to say, okay, we've done this before. In fact, we do it 1 out of 4 days of the week. How do we get there more consistently? And by setting it at that kind of 75th percentile improvement, it meant that it created the opportunity for continuous improvement, because as they got better, their 75th percentile target actually rose in terms of the actual labor productivity target. To make this successful, they worked on just a subset of departments that were the highest opportunity and provided a fair amount of near-term intensive training, such as providing lean management training, providing online tools that the leaders could use as they were working through, say, creating the value maps for their department and understanding where they could eliminate waste. And then they made sure that ongoing coaching was available to these first few key critical departments to get it right. And as they found success, then they cascaded it down to other departments and other departments. And now that they've achieved those labor productivity targets, now they're thinking about 5 years from now, how do we get to productivity that's unprecedented, that there's no external benchmark for it because no one's figured it out.
Okay, great. Thank you. I believe that's all the time we have for today. I want to again thank our presenters for their excellent presentation and for all of you who participated today. We look forward to having you join us again for future webinars. This will conclude today's program. Have a wonderful afternoon.